You're watching The Legal Breakdown. All right, so Glenn, we are now awaiting a decision on Trump's presidential immunity case that's pending before the Supreme Court. As a reminder for those watching, the next decision days at the Supreme Court are Thursday and Friday, so this is very imminent right now. But there are three very different outcomes that we can expect, so we're going to go through all three today and exactly what the implications are of each one. So Glenn, let's bang out the easy ones first. What happens in the event that Trump wins outright and if Trump loses outright?
Brian, let's start on a positive note. What happens if Donald Trump loses outright? Well, if Donald Trump loses outright, democracy wins. Why? Because then the case will be returned to Judge Tanya Chutkan, who is presiding over Donald Trump's D.C. federal prosecution for his efforts to overturn the results of the 2020 presidential election, and we go to trial. And I have maintained from day one, when the indictment started rolling in, that the minute these cases move into a court proper, move out of the court of public opinion, Donald Trump will be convicted so fast it will make his head spin, which is exactly what we saw in his New York prosecution. So if Donald Trump loses and the Supreme Court says, you know what, a president cannot violate the laws of our nation, cannot commit crimes against the American people with impunity, he can actually be indicted, prosecuted, convicted, and sentenced for those crimes. Then Judge Chutkan can put the case on the trial track, and we could see a trial in as soon as 60 to 90 days. That is the right result, in my opinion. And the reason I say it's the right result, Brian, is because of the expressed language of the Constitution, which at least some Supreme Court justices say they like to apply strictly. Well, let's see. The president is obligated, constitutionally obligated, to take care that the laws of the nation be faithfully executed. Call me crazy, feels inconsistent with that constitutional duty for a president to violate the laws of the nation. And then the other is the impeachment judgment clause, which says, in substance, a president can be impeached by the House, convicted on the articles of impeachment in a Senate trial, and he can still be prosecuted for the same conduct that got him impeached. There's two instances in the Constitution that seem to answer the question. So if Donald Trump loses, we all win, and democracy survives to fight another day. Now, if Donald Trump wins outright, a clean sweep, and he has presidential immunity and cannot be tried for any of the crimes he committed against the American people to try to unlawfully retain the power of the presidency, well then, in a very real sense, democracy loses, because that will be the Supreme Court announcing a principle that a president can commit all the crimes he wants to retain the power of the presidency, and there's not a damn thing the Department of Justice can do about it. But that gives rise to a thought experiment, Brian, and this is like stranger than fiction. But if Donald Trump wins, if that is how the Supreme Court rules, that a president has absolute immunity against prosecution, the question then becomes, what does President Joe Biden do with that power that he has just been handed by the Supreme Court? If he loses the election, does he relinquish power to somebody who has told us all he intends to be a dictator on day one? I don't know that that would be Joe Biden protecting our nation. Now, mind you, I am not advocating for Joe Biden to violate the law. But if the Supreme Court grants absolute power and makes every single person who occupies the Oval Office an absolute dictator, well, what kind of dictator do we want? An evil one or a benevolent one? Again, right. These are silly things for us to be discussing, but this is actually where we are in the United States of America at this moment in time.
All right, Glenn, let's talk about a third option here, because this is kind of a dark horse option. What happens if the decision is remanded back to the trial court?
This is a dark horse option in some ways, but I actually think it's the leading candidate, Brian, and here's why. Let's first start with civil law. In other words, if somebody tries to sue the president for some decision he made, there is actual presidential immunity against being sued civilly when you're the president, as long as whatever decisions you made, whatever actions you undertook were within the official scope of your presidential duties, even if they dwelled on the outer perimeter of your official presidential duties. Put a pin in that outer perimeter language because it's going to make a showing again in a moment. So there actually is presidential immunity against being sued for things you do while president. So what Donald Trump and his lawyers have tried to do is import that notion of civil immunity and apply it in the context of a criminal prosecution. So when a president commits crimes, he can't be prosecuted for any of them. Well, there's no precedent for that, and we just discussed how the Constitution actually contradicts that suggestion. So now let's apply that outer perimeter immunity theory to a criminal prosecution. I could see a circumstance where a president, for example, in defending our nation, orders the assassination of a foreign national that poses an imminent threat to the United States. And some might look at that and say, well, when you order the assassination of somebody, that looks a lot like murder. That looks a lot like something that could be prosecuted. So I could see the Supreme Court staking out a middle ground, not an all or nothing ruling on the presidential immunity question. So I could see the Supreme Court saying, Judge Chutkan, this is what we are directing you to do. We want you to conduct hearings in this case to decide whether all of the acts alleged in the indictment, the acts that the prosecution says constitute crimes for which Donald Trump is being prosecuted, we want you to make a decision based on the guidance we're about to give you, whether any of these acts should enjoy some sort of presidential immunity, including outer perimeter presidential immunity, not just against a civil suit, but against a criminal prosecution. And that's called a remand to the trial court with further direction from the Supreme Court. Then what they would say is after you've held all these hearings, which, take my word, Brian, will be time consuming, I'm sure Judge Chutkan will endeavor to do them quickly. But after you've made all of your rulings on what might or might not enjoy some level of presidential immunity, we want you to return the case to us for further proceedings. That procedure that I just described is something that happens not infrequently in the context of appellate litigation. But what does that mean? Well, first of all, it means the Supreme Court will have succeeded in handing Donald Trump the delay that he so desperately covets, because his real goal is to push all of his criminal prosecutions, particularly the federal ones, beyond the election date. And in the unlikely event, he becomes president again, he can literally direct his Department of Justice to kill the federal prosecutions against him. And unfortunately, he can probably also succeed in at least delaying any more state court prosecutions. So I think the most likely scenario, because this is a completely uncharted territory, is that the Supreme Court will return it to Judge Chutkan with some direction, some guidance about the hearings she is to hold, and then return it to the Supreme Court. And then, who knows, they will probably sit on it for many months and probably not decide it until the next Supreme Court term, which I believe kicks off October 1st.
So, Glenn, is your contention here that it would obviously be too extreme for the Supreme Court to rule in Trump's favor and basically to say that a president is akin to a king in this country? They're also not going to grant him a loss because it's a 6-3 conservative court that worships the ground that he walks upon. But by giving him a delay, that's really what he wants at the end of the day, without completely undermining their own credibility by handing him a win in this case. And so that's the option they're going to go for. Is that right?
Well, the only thing I'll quibble with is when you say undermining the Supreme Court's credibility, to which I respond, what credibility?
Yeah.
Because listen, if they were honest brokers of the law and the Constitution, I believe they would rule that a president who has a duty to faithfully execute the laws of the country does not have free rein to violate those very laws. I believe if we had a legitimate, fair, independent, impartial Supreme Court, it would be 9-0 rejecting Donald Trump's claim that he can't be prosecuted. They would return it to Judge Chutkan, and she would set a trial date. That is the right answer on the law, on the Constitution, and there is no precedent one way or another. That is the precedent that should be set if we want to keep our republic, if we don't want to lapse into an autocracy or a monarchy or a dictatorship.
Yep, that's exactly right. Well, we will keep an eye on this because we should, as I mentioned before, be expecting a decision to be handed down within days here, because these are the decision days for this Supreme Court term. So as soon as we have any update, we'll make sure to bring it to you. For those watching right now, if you want to follow along and get our analysis after it happens, please make sure to subscribe. The links to both of our channels are right here on this screen. I'm Brian Tyler Cohen.
And I'm Glenn Kirshner.
You're watching The Legal Breakdown.